Well, brace yourself because this morning's debate is going to be very, very tight. It's between governance, democracy, politics, as well as, at the end of the day, the wananchi and what they are experiencing as the pressures coming in from the above mentioned. Welcome to Morning at NTV. Once again, I am Priscilla Regina Naluoga. In our Kickstarter this morning, lessons from Kenyans' protests against rising costs of living, but also Kenyans bracing for anti-government protests all at the same time. Now, this morning, my guests are here to help us give us a broad analysis, not just focusing on Kenya, but what about the East African region? What's the impact on that? What's the impact on Africa? What's the global impact? The question of the global influence on the subject matter this morning. Of course, opposition leader Raila Odinga's supporters demonstrated in Nairobi and other parts of the country yesterday, engaging police in running battles, and protesters criticized the high cost of living, alleged electoral irregularities, and alleged corruption in the government of the current President William Ruto. And then at the same time, you do have the Kenyan police dispersing demonstrators in Nairobi with tear gas. You do have them doing the same with water cannons, and at least one person was shot. Now, the Odinga motorcade was also targeted with tear gas as it tried to approach the Kenyatta International Conference Center. I am joined by Joseph Ochieno, who's here to give us analysis of this conversation. But on the other side, we also do have a Kenyan counterpart, Peter Wamoto, who is online joining us here in Morning at NTV. So I'm going to start with our guest online. Good morning to you, Mr. Wamoto.
Good morning to you too. I'm fine.
All right. We would like to first pick it up from you because you are on ground, relate better with this subject matter this morning. In the last 24 hours, with your own bare eyes, what have you been able to see and make sense of regarding the protests happening?
If I may start first by saying what you are seeing happening in Kenya is a bit of insincerity on both the government side and the opposition side. I'll start with what happened yesterday, the demonstrations. I don't think if a responsible opposition needs to go to the streets and incite people so that they stone other people's buildings, they confront the police, and do other nasty things. Also, on the side of the government, there are things that the government had promised to deliver within the first 100 days, and they didn't deliver. They had said that the cost of living would go down. They had said that they'll ensure that the price of food commodities, especially unga, which a lot of Kenyans like, they'll ensure that it goes down from 200 shillings to 100 shillings. So 200 days later, they still haven't delivered what they had promised they would deliver in 100 days. But instead of both the government side and the opposition side going to parliament and ironing out the issues, they have resorted to street battles and just throwing words around. So it's very unfortunate that we, the Kenyan people, have to suffer for what the politicians are actually just doing, a small, tiny game, which they're involving all of us.
So much, Mr. Wamoto. We do have Joseph Ochieno, who is also here morning at NTV to help us understand better what's happening in Kenya. Now, picking it up from what our comrade has said, that first of all, the insincerity between the two, the right wing and the left wing. And then you get to see that at the end of the day, there was commitment that in the first 100 days, the current government would settle some of these issues, something that hasn't happened. And the hope that the two will sit on table and renegotiate a way forward. Unfortunately, now Kenya has to suffer for the protests that were called out by the Raila Odinga group.
You're absolutely right to say and call it left and right wing. I would actually baptize the Ruto administration as right wing and Raila's side as left wing. But really, to make a quick observation on our friend in Kenya. No, it's a responsibility of government to deliver on programs that's offered on these people, number one. Number two, people demonstrating is a fundamental basic right of the citizenry. And number three, it's actually one of the core democratic principles and commitments and any nation state in which citizens do not have an opportunity to vent their opinions through demonstrations and pickets is not a democracy. And this really is a taste for Kenya. It's interesting that across the African continent, so far, it is nations mentioned where these demonstrations are taking place are actually symbolic, tiny mini democracies on the continent. It's actually interesting. You'll ask yourself, and I know during break you're wondering that, well, these are things that are happening around the world. Maybe people would ask, why is it not happening in Uganda? It's not happening in Uganda, partly because this is not a democracy, and partly because we have a repressive regime that is not willing to listen to people, both at the ballot boxes and indeed post ballots. So back to the Kenyan question, Mr. Ruto committed himself, played very fantastic game of the hustler nation, the hustler leader. Apparently the hustler was a terminology picked apparently from the Raila group some time ago, but Ruto successfully managed to play it up and worked for him as the hustler, the ordinary person's candidate who would transform Kenya. 100 days usually actually in democracies. And Kenya is an average economy that within 100 days you should actually be able to have an impact in terms of effect on ordinary people. It's as suggests 200 days, so it hasn't. The prices of unga, meaning the millis, the maize flour, which is basically the staple food in Kenya, that is fundamental. It's almost like bread in Ethiopia or bread in Sudan. That's the livelihood of the ordinary people, or the price of matoke in the corners of Kampala. That, if you committed yourself to doing, you should be able to do so. Prices of fuel, you should be able to do so. Yes, I know you asked during break, and it's fair to suggest it here, that what about the elements that are arts of control of government? No. Fiscal and taxation policies of governments are used deliberately to cushion the citizenry who are the ordinary citizens in the household. You don't say that monies have delayed in the bank with my salaries and wages, and so we're going to go hungry. You either borrow, or in this case, you possibly go ahead and say, today we shall eat bread, and maybe the piece for tomorrow, we shall have it today, and then when the other monies come, we shall now eat the mili as it were. Part of the problem in Kenya is the illegitimacy of the outcome of the Ruto administration. Remember, this is something which is still an outstanding issue. It is perceived, obviously they went to court, that by and large, William Ruto did not win elections. In fact, as recent as yesterday, I was seeing something going across the social media as in the name of social whistleblower, which sort of is to the extreme, but I don't want to go there, meaning huge percentages for Raila versus Uhuru. But that's neither here nor there. I've been in Kenya within the recent several months. It's actually true that these are failings in the on the streets. And number two. Now, number three, the Ruto administration has already been accused of massive corruption, and indeed, in many cases, identity politics called tribalism. A list of names of recent appointments, including deputy governor of the Bank of Kenya, who are basically people from his communities. Yeah. So these are combination issues that
those combination issues.
This, yes.
Mr. Wamoto, hearing from your comrade here, Ocheno, in regards to these other issues that perhaps are hiding themselves in the facet of protests against high costs of living. Perhaps it's the politics at the end of the day that they're trying to make way of, the dissatisfaction of the Raila party.
According to this point, because I started by saying that there's a lot of insincerity in what is happening here. They are hiding politics behind issues that affect us as Kenyans, issues like cost of living. Because what you see Mr. Odinga trying to achieve, he's trying to overturn the results of the election that we held last year. And in my opinion, the election that we held last year was one of the most fair and free elections that we had here. I've had my friend Joseph trying to insinuate that the election was rigged, but it would surprise you that Mr. Odinga, who is a very close friend to the former president, was was actually on the side of the former president, and when they were moving around campaigning, they were saying they had the system and what they also termed as the deep state. So it is really surprising that we can now again start saying that the other side, which didn't have the system and which didn't have the deep state, rigged an election. It was even proven in the Supreme Court that no election was stolen. But that is neither here nor there. If you are to understand the Kenyan situation, you have to go back a couple of years ago. Mr. Odinga has been in politics for the last almost 40 years. William Samoei Ruto, our president, has been in politics ever since he graduated from high school, from campus, and he joined the late president Moi, Daniel Toro, teacher at Moi, and he was working under him and he was mentored. So these people have a way of playing crafty politics at the expense of just doing what they have been elected to do. Because if you look at these two people, you see that Mr. Odinga has a good number of both MPs and senators, and Mr. Ruto, our president, also has even more numbers than Mr. Odinga, both in parliament and in the Senate. So if it is the issue about lowering cost of living, they can do legislation, and for example, they did legislation on gas, cooking gas, and they removed taxes on cooking gas. So by July this year, we will be buying cooking gas at around 500 Kenya shillings, down from 2,800. So that simple act of legislation of just removing tax on gases has already dropped the cost of gas, and it will have to go down by July. If they did the same for Unga and other things, then we wouldn't even be needing to go to the streets to engage police in running battles. Another issue, also I'd say that for you to understand the Kenyan situation, you have to go back a couple of years. What is happening right now reminds me of, and it started the way it started right now. People started demonstrating, and then all of a sudden, it was full force chaos. And again, it was Mr. Odinga who was saying that he had been rigged out. So,
okay.
We really need to consider such issues, and peace is more important than all those demonstrations.
Peter, we can't say that the government is trying to do something. We can't say in its entirety that it's not doing anything about the issues that you're grappling with. But in the case of your analysis in the last 24 hours, to the people that took to the streets to make their grievances known, in your assessment, do you feel that it was more like party-lenient people that went to the streets, or it was genuinely Kenyans dissatisfied with what's happening going to the streets?
Those who are interested in overthrowing the government, and also those who are genuinely feeling that well, and we don't have food, we don't have money, we don't even have money to pay school fees and rent and all that. So you see, since Raila Odinga has a strong following, when he appeals to the things that affect us, most people just take to the streets. You can remember that in the last election, we had 22 million registered voters, but only 14 million voted. So there's a whole 8 million who didn't vote, but part of them also took part in the protests yesterday.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Peter Wamoto, on the other side of Kenya. Thank you so much, Sarah Birete, for joining us. Good morning to you.
Good morning, and apologies for coming back.
All right. Now, when you joined us, of course, we were making sense of the situation. Privileged to have you here on set because you are one of the observers of the election process that happened in their last election in Kenya. And you returned here to Uganda, gave us a good report that Kenyans had honestly had a free and fair election. However, it happens to be one of the embedments of the process that we are seeing months later after that election. Yet, from the observer's point of view, economy of Kenya was good and was promising to even be better.
Well, the Kenyan election and even the democratic process has been generally improving. And but are there still challenges? Yes, there are. You know, there's a general global decline democratically, and as observers, we are struggling with connecting the dots and seeing how to push back and make sure the citizens' voice is amplified in democratic processes. Kenya's election process, after Supreme Court, there were dissenting voices. Even in the process of the Supreme Court, you could see the lawyers saying this is not fair, the report is, but the courts decided, and we thought that was a done deal. But when it comes to democratic processes, you know, I think Ruto promised too much in his Hustler Nation campaign, but immediately when he came in, he could not even continue. For example, the UNGA subsidies that Uhuru Kenyatta was doing, and the fuel, the UNGA and fuel subsidies, immediately he cut them off. Then what happens to the hustlers? A platform that he used to come into power. So when you have a closely divided, really an evenly divided country, because the difference of 233,000 votes that Ruto garnered after contestations is really not something that should put a president in a place of comfort. You normally need to reach out and do what is known as horse trading politically, and make sure you have a balanced country to lead. And I think that's what has largely failed. Instead, there were manipulations of distorting the coalition, as mere coalition, breaking it up, buying people here and there, and buying majority in Parliament and Senate, which I think was not properly needed to provide a balance in the country. So the cost of living is rising. Kenya is also in high debt distress. It's a large economy, yes, about 3 times more than Uganda, but also the higher you go, the hotter some issues come. It was coming through a backdrop of legacy projects, the standard gauge railway, the express to the airport, that increased their debt, and they are in high debt distress. Recently, there was that talk by the Tanzanian president of countries that don't have reserves. It has also largely depleted its reserves, like Uganda, which is also has also halved its reserved in 3 years. And so you have the dollar exchange by yesterday was above 4,000 in our equivalent Uganda shillings, because it was $1.40 Kenyan shillings. That creates its own dynamics. And the cheapest lunch is around 16,000 Ugandan shillings. So that really is, you know, puts the hustlers at the worst situation. So who is on the road? One, the 3 tests for demonstrations is their public interest. So when you have this kind of struggle by the ordinary citizens, of course there is public interest. And there are questions. There are questions about even expenditure on prayers and entertainment of religious leaders. Recently, you know, just 1 week ago, a Kenyan economist put the cost of entertainment of religious leaders and the prayers and religious fanaticism at 50 million Kenyan shillings. That's about 1.4 billion in our Ugandan shillings, just in a space of 6 months. And then you have the rhetoric. The rhetoric of saying I cannot talk to anyone. I wouldn't think Raila is looking for a job. You see, what some politicians forget is that you need political harmony in a country. You need consensus. You need legitimacy. Legitimacy is not purely driven from an election. It is not a one-off. There is an election, there are outcries. I've been seeing religious leaders saying, open the servers. If you are sure you have the numbers, why don't you open the servers? Religious leaders. Yesterday, religious leaders were saying, why appoint 50 district, counter administrators when our economy is in distress, when you cannot help cushion the poor person, the hustler, from the skyrocketing cost of living. So all these political calculations should be made.
You've spoken of religious leaders, and of course, in the scriptures, there's one of the lines in there that says, the poor will always be amongst us. So the hustlers, in this case, will always be amongst the population of Kenya. But nevertheless, at the end of the day, you have also made mention of the comparison in terms of, for example, the dollar to the Kenyan shilling.
Yeah.
And if you are going to relate it to us here in Uganda, our shilling is much weaker than the Kenyan shilling. So
our exchange is at 3,700. Their exchange by yesterday was 4,041 shillings, our equivalent.
And again, stemmed by what's happening. So the economics element of it also comes into play. Yet Kenya is one of the largest and strongest economies that we have within the East African region. So for a situation like this, Joseph, in regards to what is happening, what then is at stake for the country?
I think sort of Sarah has summed it up, including the question of the dollar and monetary value element, that at the moment, as of today, you'd say that the Kenyan per dollar is struggling more than an average Ugandan. And that's basically the point. And if it is the kind of economy that Kenya is, and if it's from where Ruto picked it up, maybe particularly if you went back perhaps about 10 months before the peak of elections, then you see that Kenyans are substantially sunk. You know, I was looking at these demonstrations and including what's happening, including in London the other day, and then part of the big trade unionists in the UK was talking at his Twitter handle of how over a 12-month period, the average British citizen under this terrible right-wing conservative regime has sunk the average wages for the lower echelon, while over a 3 or so year period, I don't remember the season, I mean the period, the number of billionaires in pounds have trebled. That's what we're talking about. At the beginning of the conversation where you put left, right, I was actually emphasizing this. You know, the broader thing which is going to happen, as Sarah sort of hinted, is the re-emergence of the debate around neoliberalism that was imposed on the African continent. Very soon we're going to begin to need leaders, and Raila is actually one of those on the continent, leaders who speak the language of the people and push at the core of the issues affecting our people. People are going to begin to have conversations around questions of how we put profit before lives, how we put profit in education, profit in health, profit in infrastructure, excess infrastructure that is, profit in agriculture. Kenya is actually a very, very unfortunate nation state relative to Uganda when it comes to the question of day-to-day living in terms of subsistence living. Most of our rural Uganda people will survive without necessarily land or an income, I mean, without income because they will depend on their average land, ancestral land. In Kenya particularly, it is actually not that very easy. So these are real issues. So in Kenya's case, just to quickly wrap up again on what Sarah talked about, there is nothing much more important than legitimacy, as I said earlier, and then this thing called political perception. Quickly to link that. Again, only yesterday, I think it's one of the Kenyan news headlines, was that Ruto, can you imagine Ruto, his vice president, very rich guys with very interesting questioned backgrounds leading to the elections without prejudice, and Mudavadi, 3 top guys in Kenya, got new vehicles worth 802 million in Kenya.
No. It has happened for us here in Uganda in Parliament.
No, because we're discussing Kenya. And to suggest that these guys need new cars, need new cars, that's why I actually globally contextualize it. You know, the sooner we started having ideological conversations about left, right, and values and many of these other things, the more we shall realize that even here in Uganda, we are being ripped off by fronts of neoliberalism, excess profit, versus ordinary people who don't have the voices. So it makes it worse in Uganda's case, where we don't necessarily have the voices, but it even makes it much more difficult in Kenya's case, where I said the capitalist establishment is almost perfected, and the bottom majority are really, really in a terrible state.
Okay, all right. Where we stand right now, it's between a hard rock and We still need to make sense of what's happening in Kenya. Later on, we'll be asking Peter the damage that has happened and what's the damage control moving forward, at least for the rest of the week. And thereafter, the impact of this on not just on Kenya's economy, but the people and the politics of Kenya right after this break. To stay with. So behind the scenes, the debate is in comparison of the state of politics for both Uganda as well as Kenya. But recently, of course, we had the border between Kenya and Uganda, Busia, being closed. As of this morning, we want to have a better understanding of what that looks like in the wake of the protests in the last 24 hours. Now, we do have David Awari, who's on ground, and he's speaking to the chairperson, the Uganda Cross-Border Trade Association, to give us a better picture of the realities and the impact of this on ground. Good morning to you, David.
Zona zabadde zipakinze nga zirinze bafunyeeko bali kuyita Malaba Eldoret basobole okutuuka Mirembe eneko baali gati tezigenda eyadde ogiraba ekyali nkalu.
Emmotoka ntono eziyingira e Kenya kati
emmotoka ezingira ntono era ezisinga zasuze wano teziwera n'emmotoka 20 eziraba ezisinga obungi ezitise zizino zipakinze zitidde okgenda.
We had almost no truck crossing Kenya, but today I'm happy that trucks have started crossing. Some people can cross with the goods. I'm standing at the customs and people, business has gone on. And I think there is now hope that today and the rest of the days there will be trade flow at the border. However, yesterday, which is contrary to what happened yesterday, because yesterday they did not see any single person crossing. All the Ugandans who had crossed had to return back to their country very fast in fear of what was taking place in Kenya.
Well, he has painted for us a picture there. And now, of course, you know the realities of the matter is that Kenya is a trade route for us here in Uganda, a conversation we'll later tap into. But let me turn back to Peter Wamoto in Kenya and first find out what's the damage so far that has been caused by these protests and what's the expected damage that could be caused if this continues on.
Yes, if you followed yesterday, our Deputy President, Rigathi Gachagua, stated that the losses that emanated from the demonstrations yesterday in the Nairobi Central Business District was being valued at approximately 2 billion, because that is the amount of revenue they collect every day, 2 billion Kenya shillings in Nairobi alone. And the impact of that is that most roads were closed, and you see there are some of the vehicles that transport goods from Mombasa all the way to Malaba, the border town bordering Kenya and Uganda, and even into Uganda. So most of the roads, including Mombasa Road, Uhuru Highway, yesterday, for the better part of yesterday, they were closed. And generally speaking, if you were to approximate the amount of money we lost yesterday during the demonstrations, it's even maybe about close to 4 billion. Remember also that yesterday some of the shops were vandalized, and especially in Kisumu City, which is in the lakeside near Lake Victoria, near Uganda, and we saw a lot of businesses being vandalized, a lot of property being destroyed. There was a car that was burnt. There was an office that was also vandalized. Generally, we had a lot of great losses. If you were to investigate what really ails the Kenyan economy, I will put corruption to be the first. Joseph had mentioned that some money had been allocated to buy vehicles for some of these top government officials. In fact, in my opinion, I think he understated the amount of money that these people actually requested, because it was actually not 820 million, but 1.5 billion Kenya shillings was allocated to the offices of both the president and the deputy to fund their allowances and also vehicles, to buy for them vehicles, them and their spouses, at the expense of us ordinary Kenyans. There's one lady that I was supporting in the last general election called Justina Wamae. She was a presidential running mate, and she has remained vocal in some of these matters. She's neither right nor left. Hers is a moderate approach, centrist moderate approach to these issues, where we give practical solutions. And I think I love her style because she isn't advocating for, she's also part of opposition, not on the side of Raila, but by virtue of having contested in the last election, she's also giving some of her ideas that the government can use to correct some of these things that are happening. And she has been very vocal about corruption. She has been very vocal against divisive politics. And you saw those demonstrations. I'm sure that the impact is even being felt across the border in Uganda, where people are. And it's very unfortunate that both our economies have to suffer because of the greed, what I can just simply call the greed of some of these political leaders and the bravado of the government. You know, our President William Samuel Ruto and his deputy Rigathi Gachagua are people who I think are very short on humility. They like chest stamping. They like, Sarah had mentioned this, they like telling the opposition that we are not going to give you any work, we are not going to work with you. And you see, that can't happen. In a democracy like ours, that can't happen. Legitimacy doesn't end at just an election. We have to bring now all these leaders on board, including even all the other aspirants who contested for the presidency. And if anyone has a good idea of how these things can be run, and especially on the issue of the cost of living, which is affecting all of us as Kenyans, whether you support government, whether you support opposition, whether you support any other person, the issue of cost of living, if anyone has an idea of how they can help, then I think the government needs to listen to these ideas.
Met Peter Omoto in Kenya, and perhaps our comrades here could offer a ray of light in one way or another. But of course, he said that whatever is happening in Kenya does get to affect us here in Uganda. Turning to you, Joseph, recently we did have Ugandan's milk being banned in Kenya, but these bans have been relating to maize, to eggs previously. So just looking at the trade relations between us and Kenya, they've been stiffy and fluctuating over the course of time. Where we stand right now with this protest, seemingly the dependence of Uganda and Kenya economic-wise is unstable. Where do we go from here?
It's absolute common sense. We just need to learn from what Kenyans are doing, but also Kenyans need to learn what democracy is all about. As I say, democracy in particular, including when it comes to questions of protests or demonstrations, they're actually not partisan issues. They should be real about issues things, number two. Number three, most importantly, political leaders in Africa, across this continent, ought to learn to listen to the citizens. Politics is about perceptions, but it's also about people taking positions. When people go to the street, they're saying that what you've done at the ballot is insufficient, what you're doing in parliament is sufficient, you're perhaps delaying deliveries. So really, democratic leaders listen to people when they're protesting. What are the issues? And in fact, usually they go back and legislate. And in many cases, some very big demonstrations in the street of Kampala, when it comes, it will ever come. You know, Mr. Museveni, whether he likes it or not, it will ever come. When big demonstrations come, you go back and say, these million people march into the city. We have listened to you, the people. We are reviewing our policies. We are reviewing our positions. It does not matter from whose voice we're the opposition in government. And by the way, if I may say so, demonstrations like this is about cost of living. It's about the idea that we must open up our rail networks. If it's the case that we should kill the potholes in Kampala, people from across the political divide, usually even political leaders from the governing political party, except occasionally people from cabinet, would come. And in fact, some people, members of cabinet, will come and to become issues of discussion where you're supporting right or left and things like that. Now, for back into the Kenyan thing, it's very much important that this matter is resolved amicably in Kenya. It is also the case that those of us in Uganda, we should hope and pray that it works, but we have lessons to learn. But if I may say so, talking about actually the Kisumu Busia border, there was actually an incident at Maseno University, which is between Kisumu and Busia, and a student died. And the governor of Kisumu issued a statement saying that, look, the police officer who actually used live bullet on the student must be tried. And that was rather an impressive statement from the governor, Professor Nyang' Nyong'o. What he's saying is actually democracy must prevail. People must have a right to protest and to demonstrate, and actually security forces need to be able to respond properly. In the event that this actually continues in Kenya, and therefore that the security services in Kenya act in a restraint, recognize this as a basic democratic right of the citizens to do so. I hope it will not spill over in such a manner that will affect the question of the flow of goods and services into Uganda.
Sarah, you're very, very eminent when it comes to citizen participation. Citizens do participate by voting these leaders into power. Then you do have citizens participating by paying their taxes so that these leaders can commit and fulfill their promises to the citizens. And then the other way citizens also participate is by protesting so that they can air out their grievances and their leaders can listen to them, which unfortunately rarely happens on the African continent. How best can then the citizens who are being affected by this handle the pressure that they are feeling at the bottom of the scale?
You know, yesterday was an interesting day.
And what else can they do, honestly?
In terms of demonstrations. You had the big economies in Africa.
Yes.
Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa, with citizens taken to the streets. And most of the reasons are economic related. It's about economic rights. When it comes to Africa, unfortunately, I don't know how we have, for 6 decades, had almost the same crop of leadership that does not necessarily respect freedoms. I was so happy with the President Ramaphosa's statement when he said citizens have a right to demonstrate, but don't threaten or intimidate others to join you. I think that was a fairer statement, and it's unfortunate that 4 people lost their lives in South Africa demonstrations. So citizens need to know their place in governance. Power belongs to the people. I know that we use or at times misabuse this statement. But when you don't understand...
It's what it said, Sarah, but look at the impact of power belonging to the people.
No, the people do not understand.
To bloodshed.
No. The people do not understand how power belongs to them. If you look at the comments by mainly Ugandan elite, they thought, Kenya, how can Raila do this? Why are you destroying the economies? So we are coming from our consistent abuse of power and excessive use of force to curtail people's right to assemble and demonstrate, to condemn the other people, thinking they are getting out of the line. So we've taken the abnormal situation in Uganda as the norm. And we are saying, you are going to destroy the economy. Yes, 2 billion Kenyan shillings were lost. But what is the cost of democracy? Democracy is priceless. Freedoms are priceless.
Can I just say this quickly? That's one of the reasons why leaders, political leaders, knowing very well that demonstrations will be disruptive, when there is demand from the people, take action before people go to demonstrations, which usually tend to be a last resort, short of people going to the bush.
Which action was actually, preempted? It's not that it actually just happened, but it was preempted. They've been talking about this coming to reality.
For about 2 months.
So that would have given the government enough time to respond and cushion themselves prior to it.
Yes, either you act or you leave people to express their wishes, their grievances. You look at France, they've been on the street over the increasing the retirement age.
From 60 to
64. But does anybody shoot them?
And by the way, once again, I'm really sorry. In UK, there was huge success. Of course, that's my interest. The trade union, RMT, the Transport Workers Union, they successfully managed to compel the government for a pay rise of 14.5%, and that is not little money. And then normally they will say, oh, where is the money going to come from? No, that's the reality of governance. People, power.
Yes, and the leaders should come and say, people are marching, they have a petition.
That's correct.
Let me receive it. Even if you have enough courage, address them and say, let me read into your concerns, I will get back to you. Who are your leaders?
Okay, let me turn to Peter. Peter, I want to hear from you. You've had of your comrades here in studio with us this morning in terms of citizen participation. From where you stand, what do you hope President William Ruto is going to do in response of this protest?
Okay, thank you. I'd like to pick up from where Sarah has left. Most of us citizens, whether it's here in Kenya or even there in Uganda, or you saw what happened in South Africa yesterday and other parts of Africa, most of us don't understand exactly how this power belongs to us. When we see the people wielding power are those who are in offices. So ours is a democratic space, ours here in Kenya. We are allowed to do peaceful. You see, we have to underline that part, not just saying that we are allowed to do demonstrations, but peaceful demonstrations and picketing. That is allowed here in Kenya, and it has been done over and over again. And nobody is going to limit that space anytime soon because it's a constitutional right. I think for a very long time, that is how we are going to be airing our grievances. I want to assure you that even if it was Raila who had won the last election, right now, Ruto and these people would have been in the streets, maybe probably calling for lowering cost of living and all that stuff. But what I wish, now coming back to your question, what I wish that President William Samoei Ruto can do, let him tone down on bravado, let him tone down on chest thumping, and let him even call Raila for a dialogue. Not in the sense that happened last time with the former regime where there was a handshake and then the opposition dissolved. But they can sit down with both Raila and other opposition leaders like Justina Wamae and also listen to some of these ideas that can help them to lower the cost of living, because that is a point of contention where whether you're pro-government or pro-opposition or you don't even care about politics, but all Kenyans care about the cost of living, and that is where these leaders can work together to lower the cost of living. And that is what I wish that our President William Samoei Ruto can try to do in the coming weeks, because Raila has already given an ultimatum and he has said that every Monday there will be demonstrations until most of his wishes are granted. He has also said that the issue of electoral integrity, that it needs to be reviewed, but I think that is too late for now, because we already went through the process up until the Supreme Court, and nothing was found to be truthful in their petition. So we saw the petition being thrown out. What I really wish, we don't escalate these demonstrations into violent altercations with the police or with other people's businesses. Let Raila talk to his supporters and ensure that there are peaceful demonstrations. And even before any demonstration happens, any other demonstration happens, I wish that the president can reach out to all these other leaders and just engage them where they can agree on bare minimums.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I like what he has mentioned, that even if it was Raila Odinga in power, as long as decisions were made that led Kenyans to this point, it would still be the same case scenario that we're dealing with. So it's not the sitting president, it's the decisions of the sitting president in power. But protests, let's talk about the element of protests. And I'll turn to you, Sarah. What are the core principles and fundamentals of protests as a tool of governance?
You know, one, there must be a public interest, an agreed concern by a reasonable number of members of society. Is it a matter of public concern? You know, it should pass that test. Two, there must be that other avenues have reasonably failed. So have the Kenyans discussed the cost of living in Parliament? Have they discussed at governorial level? Or are there options to address the cost of living, for example, in the budget? And if not, then how do you demand? Because the budget is almost coming to a conclusive end. So the third test should be that there is space to influence policy and action of the duty bearers on the issue that you're protesting about. For example, if Kenyans get relief, some reliefs on the cost of living, which is a major issue, or even promises to reduce corruption, promises to stop expanding the size of government, as if Kenya is in competition with Uganda, where we have really failed. So those are some of the demands, I hope, that the Kenyans are making.
All right.
So once the issue passes this test, then the fourth test is that it must be non-violent. So the organizers must ensure. I'm not saying that it's their obligation, because police should keep law and order, but the methods of demonstration should be non-violent. So this is the four-way test for public
just on the
demonstrations.
non-violence element, from where I'm seated, usually when people hear non-violent, they are really looking to the law and order group or forces or department to be the ones to actually make it non-violent. Not forgetting that the protesters themselves too must protest in a non-violent way.
No, the organizers, the methods. Because if you are saying we are going to march,
if you're going to throw tires in the street,
yes, that's what I'm saying.
If you're going to be,
no, let me put it this way.
And stealing, that's violence, honestly.
Priscilla, again, we should not increase the burden as if the burden is on the organizers.
Yes,
the methods, if you're saying that we are going to march, or like we had the Black Monday movement in Uganda, it was a protest, a civil protest against corruption. So you are saying every Monday we shall wear black, maybe watch on the street and have conversations with the people about black. That, the methods are non-violent. Now what individuals do is not the obligation or the burden of organizers. Like you say, we are planning to march to State House, like Kenya was planning. People are burning tires, people are rooting. At times it might even be the other side, planning to create chaos, which normally happens in the rest democratic countries.
Those are the loopholes of protesters, and as to why they're not working on the African continent. Unless, Joseph, you do have a state or a country that you can pinpoint and say that when protests went down in this country, it bared fruit.
Do you know what?
But Arab Spring was here.
Yes.
And
indeed, Tunisia was also part of this question. So was Senegal. I must say that protests are possible in this country, Uganda, and I hope that you are able to join me, of course not from your set, on helping to organize protests against potholes, protests against corruption, and protests against theft of iron sheets from amongst the poorest of the poor in this country.
Do you want to bring the Karachunas on the streets?
Indeed, and I would like to be able to help organize that. I successfully organized, participated in, and engaged and actually led demonstrations over 20 years, particularly against Mr. Museveni while I was away in the UK. And none of them was ever violent, to the extent that I'd reached a stage in which all I would do was to let the police know, because we need a bit of their presence, and they'll say, where and how many people do you expect? And then you turn up down there. And including some of the days, they'll say, oh, but Joseph, you said you're expecting 80, but there were all about 20 people here. And
so where have we lost the spirit of protesting?
No, I'm bringing it. We have really, under NRA, we've really never had an opportunity to be able to do that. And in fact, there is a concerted effort to push against it. And I think the regime must be extremely uncomfortable that these things are happening in Kenya, and maybe they're wishing, they're wishing that there's some deaths and some major disruption, so that they say no to Uganda. No. These things have happened in Africa successfully. These things can happen in Uganda. Now, the point about violence is this. Usually, and I've been engaged in many of these things, both actually in Europe and Africa, different kind of places. What Sarah is saying is, say people are going for a rally at Kolo Airstrip, people go there and they gather there, 1 million Ugandans. Go down there with posters. Police should be their friends holding buttons. Kenya the other day, by then, the rally in Bungoma, which I saw bits of it, there was only one person with apparent arm. The rest of the other officers, police officers, carry buttons. So really, clearly, you start from there, it becomes non-confrontational. You start from there, police become your facilitators and enablers rather than your enemies and enemies. But of course, on the other hand, some of these things will be because people are extremely angry. Then, of course, there is also leadership of Protestants. And then for even the Kenyan case, there was a report yesterday where it is believed that one of the protests actually in Kisumu, it's being investigated, by the way, that some anti-protesters came in to contribute, and actually is officially being investigated. Again, I saw that from the Twitter hand of the governor. It's interesting, again from Kenya, where there was this video showing protesters pushing back security services, meaning security services did by and large the right thing, that if you get overwhelmed, you pull back, meaning they did not fire live bullets. That is what people in power, particularly in abusive power, fear. What people in abusive power should be doing is to respond to public opinion. But when it comes really to say the execution of these other things, usually it will not really be the problem whether people walk through Kampala streets. By the way, in 1986, I was one of the lead protesters from Makerere University to the streets of Kampala, you know, protesting and demanding this against the killing of Samora Machel.
I wanted to say something, that in Uganda we have had a few successful protests, but only when they favor government position. Recently, we had protests about the EU Parliament decisions on ECOP.
Yes.
Government protests were peaceful.
They provided fuel and water.
Fuel, you bring people, including children, to present petitions, and the EU delegation received these petitions. We also had the other most recent demonstration, was when the president demonstrated against corruption. Through that walking corruption out of Kampala, it was peaceful.
Is it the one Olanya reminded him that all of us are corrupt?
Yeah, the rate Olanya.
Okay, so we're going to relate this conversation to the POMA Act. And then we see where we take it from there. What kind of scary place to be in at such a time as this? Now, I would like to start capping conclusion to this conversation. And let me start with Peter Wamoto in Kenya. Peter, the reality of the matter is that Kenyan economy is the biggest economy. So many promises are coming through from your economy. And of course, we've had to learn so many things as other states in comparison to your economy. Now, with this kind of pressure at hand, if this was to be the trend to continue, do you feel that government will be compelled to have a reconsideration and fulfill their commitments?
Yes, I'm actually wishing that at some point government moves with speed to reconsider certain things, including even returning the subsidies to unga and the petroleum products, so that generally the cost of living can go down, and also reach out to the opposition, both Honorable Raila Amolo Odinga and also the likes of Justina Wamare, so that we can deliberate on certain bare minimums which the government can do in order to avert future protests. One of the speakers who had spoken earlier, I think Deputy Director of Council of Bus Owners, if I'm going to get it right, said that Kenya needs Uganda the same way Uganda needs Kenya, and even all our other neighbors. That is why you can see we sent troops to Somalia to stem out terrorists. We have sent troops to Congo to also fight rebels over there. And we have generally always had a good relationship with our neighbors, save for the fact that sometimes our fishermen are arrested in Lake Victoria by Ugandan authorities. But I think those are issues that we usually streamline and we move on. But we have had a good relationship with all of our neighbors, including even Tanzania, Southern Sudan, and we pray that it remains that way. But I would like to assure the people of Uganda not to be afraid to come to Kenya, because generally those demonstrations yesterday were relatively peaceful, and we are hoping it stays that way, or even we avoid really going back to the streets. So business is normal currently from today, Tuesday, because the next time demonstrations are going to be held is on Monday next week. So Ugandans can also come to Kenya, and we can also come over there. I was even wishing that this interview, I would have been maybe required to come to Uganda and sit physically in the studio with
Peter,
Sarah
you have said that this is going to be a recurring one every Monday. So hopefully next Monday you'll be with us here in studio. That's a commitment we're expecting from you. But thank you so much for having been a part of that conversation. And good luck to Kenya. Now turning to my pundits here in studio, of course we do have the realization of the socio-political class divide that's also influencing the subject matter. Sarah, could you speak into that?
Well, I want to first comment on the trade directly. When you look at Kenya, the size of the economy, you know, it's a common sense that when they cough, we catch a cold. But for long we have been talking about alternatives. Alternatives using the Mombasa, the Tanzania route, using water transport. I know that January this year there was a vessel, a new vessel launched, the MT Kabaka Muenda Mutevi II, which has capacity to carry fuel. Because what is expected now, unless Kenyans sit and have dialogue and resolve the issues concerning cost of living especially, which is of high public interest, you expect that every Monday there will be disruptions in the transport. So you would expect the planners in Uganda to be saying, for Monday, if you have goods that must move out of Sunday, Monday, you are using the Tanzania route, you are using the water transport, maybe we are putting a second modern vessel, and we are able to have constant fuel supplies. Because the cost of fuel in Uganda is still abnormally high.
We have just
the
been
cost of living in Uganda is abnormally high.
Recently.
The reason Ugandans are not on the streets, it's not that we are not feeling the pinch or we don't have concerns. It's because of excessive abuse of power to the rights of the people.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. Speaking of excessive abuse of people's rights here in Uganda, most recently we did have the Constitutional Court coming out to make a decision on the POMA Act 2013 and saying that some of the elements in there do criminalize this one thing that we're talking about, protesting, which is ought to be the right of the people and is constitutional. It was being deemed unconstitutional through those sections, but as of the Constitutional Court today, it's deemed a right and constitutional. That should not be abused. Where do we go from here in conclusion, Joseph?
It's a shame that we have had to live to the expectations of this, and bringing this back to the ideological context across the continent. It's actually a shame on the NRA regime, which allegedly is revolutionary and left-leaning, as it were, to have this as a subject of conversation at all, to even attempt to criminalize using the Constitution, the right to assemble, the right to protest, the right to picket, which is, as I said, amongst the most basic, is an indictment on them. So I really hope that whatever is happening in Kenya, maybe every other time as we are looking much more at the trade and the travel impact of it, that we should actually look at the politics of it on the continent. That maybe this is a waking up call, as I said at the beginning, that African leaders should begin to see that the neoliberal policies and the programs that they bought is not working, that we should actually begin to mobilize our national and continental resources much more towards the deliveries of the day-to-day services for our people.
Okay.
That perhaps the more we do that, the more independence we have for our people. In this particular case, even in Uganda, the less dependent we will be. But quickly for the Kenyan case, I think if NRA had not killed Uganda Railways, it may be much easier that freight would be moved quicker over the 4 to 5 days window in between into Uganda, so that we don't have to go through many of these other things. But finally, that yes,
did we just kill the Uganda Railway? Oh, we have even failed to construct a standard gauge railway.
But at the end of the day, making conclusion of this conversation, what has become of the matter is that one, deep state, the insincerity of the government, but also the opposition in as to why, what's the backbone, what's the actual agenda that is hidden behind the Kenyan protests. But also government promising that within 100 days they will have cut down on the prices, the costs of unga and fuel. That has not matured for Kenyans through yet. And so that definitely is pressurizing. At the end of the day, democracy is priceless, as was said, and ought to be free. And protests are a right. Kenyans are hopefully using it in the right way. Every Monday, they're committing to go to the streets and make their voices heard until change is made. That brings us to the end of this conversation. We trust that in your own way you'll be able to make better decisions in regards to what's happening within the region. Thank you so much for watching Morning at NTV. I am Priscilla Regina Naluga. Good day.